If you live in California, you've likely felt the contradiction. We set ambitious climate targets, pass major policy bills, and celebrate record infrastructure funding. And then we sit in traffic. Housing stays out of reach, and the projects that would actually change daily life take years to show up. In this conversation, we're pulling back the curtain on why. Because somewhere between authorizing funds and groundbreaking, something gets held up. My guests today are Adie and Ben Swedberg from Brookings Metro, leaders in infrastructure and place-based policy research. Adie is a senior fellow whose work on infrastructure and urban economics has been highlighted by major international outlets, and Ben's work on federal and regional infrastructure investments has influenced how policymakers are helping to deliver projects across the country. Today we start at the federal level and then zoom into Adie and Ben's latest California research, where they argue that achieving climate goals isn't about major transit corridors, but rather about supporting infrastructure for infill housing. I'm Kate Gasparo, and this is Building Better Cities. Well, to start, can you describe the mission of Brookings Metro and how your research on infrastructure and transportation delivery influences actual decision making?
Yeah, I love this question. So Brookings Metro has been around over 25 years. We're housed within the oldest think tank in the world, which is a horrible phrase. I won't use it again. And officially, our job is to try to take the biggest challenges of the day facing places, so cities, suburbs, small towns, and try to think about applied solutions that can work for the leaders in those places.
And who pays you to do this work?
We're very fortunate that we have a great reputation, and that's a testament to the high quality and integrity of the work we do. There are supporters out there, typically from either the foundation world of philanthropy, corporate philanthropy, or individual philanthropy, who support that approach, right? And really want an independent, apolitical set of commentators out there riffing on issues. So no one owns us, which is a really cool place to be.
Well, I like that you said apolitical, because I'd like to think that housing and infrastructure is really bipartisan. All these issues are local. And I would love for you to speak to that, especially because it's been a huge topic of conversation on the political scene is how are we delivering these projects? And I think what is foundational to that is the state of play on infrastructure funding and financing. So it's been about 5 years since the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was passed. That's our last big infrastructure bill at a federal level. And I'm curious, how much has been authorized? How much has been spent? And how does this money flow from a federal initiative down to states and localities?
Yeah, the Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act, or we just call it affectionately IIJA, authorized all told just about 160 billion. And that is not just for transportation, although that is the vast majority of what it authorized. Kind of came up almost simultaneously with the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a little bit of money of its total around 150 billion dedicated to transportation. But most of that was going towards energy programs and other environmental programs. Right at the end of the previous presidential administration, about 600 billion had been awarded in IIJA dollars, and about 100 billion had been awarded in IRA dollars. And so what that means is the administration had, for the most part, been keeping up with the pace that it was supposed to be obligating and awarding these funds. And that took a couple different forms, right? To your question about how does that actually get down to communities, it authorized two kinds of spending by the federal government. The first might be something a lot of people heard of. It's the discretionary or competitive grants, but they made up only roughly a quarter of the total dollars that were authorized in the IIJA. A vast majority was going through formula. And these are pre-existing formulas that use a bunch of different metrics to basically send big chunks of money to the states and then gives them, with some guardrails, pretty wide latitude to spend that however they want.
Is there a different velocity between discretionary and formula dollars for getting those dollars to become actual projects?
Yeah, so there's a huge difference. Washington has really woken up to this. And the short part of the answer, I'll go longer, but is the formula money is so much better. And there's a few reasons for that. But to spin it backwards a little bit, we got rid of earmarks, which at one point were like a 4-letter word in Washington. This idea of Congress people just greasy hand style, negotiating with one another. It got all these bad optics. And so what we turned to was what were these competitive grants that whomever was the presidential administration, whoever was running the Department of Transportation, Environmental Protection Agency, et cetera, like that they would choose where monies would go. IJ put this on steroids, as Ben talked about. You're talking about $200+ billion in these. It's been an ambitious nightmare. And there's a few reasons for that. The biggest one of all that personally I feel, especially from that more local angle that we really take our work, and right, I know, Kate, you're really focused on it too, is you got to prepare all these materials to apply for these projects. Folks do all that homework, but they can't commit any real money to match the federal funds until they know the federal funds are coming through. Even when they pick you as a winner, there is still so much more to do, most notably to kind of stack together that funding package. Like no one's just squirreling away like $25 million for capital projects because you're going to get it matched by the Fed. You're going to spend that $25 million on what you need right then and there. And so it's really been slow. You add in the bits of all these applications aside at the federal level, you toss in that the Trump administration, really different priorities than the Biden administration. It's just been a nightmare, procedurally speaking. The advantage, though, what was cool is that cities and counties and even states could apply for these directly. And that's something they couldn't afford before. But the big winners really have been those formula award winners, which is mostly states, as Ben noted.
And you've written about there's sort of another disconnect here between formula dollars that are going to states and then formula dollars that then get down to cities, and that there's an imbalance because of the density of infrastructure in cities and the need to support the infrastructure there. But states are holding a lot of these dollars for their own assets, which sit outside of cities. So can you sort of speak through that portion of the formula disconnect? And then I want to talk about, does formula mean flexible? So I just want you to anticipate that.
Yeah, there is this disconnect that we have basically uncovered through some painstaking looking at this data that the U.S. Department of Transportation provides us. And so we're looking at two things. We're looking at where are people traveling? What roads are they traveling on? And who is getting the money? And where's that money being spent? So the way these formulas work, right, that the money goes to the state. And in almost every case, with almost every program that's sending money, the state has almost complete discretion over where and how to spend it. Our research has shown, and this is using 2022 data, about a third of vehicle miles traveled, that's all miles traveled by all drivers, are being driven on roads that the state doesn't own. And the federal government doesn't really own roads. So then those are city, county, township roads. But data from the federal government tells us that only roughly 16 or so % of these federal dollars are reaching those governments, are being spent by them, or even just on their assets by the state. That's a huge gap between what's happening on those roads and what's being spent on them.
Are there states that do this better than other states, in which they are working more closely with their city partners to identify the projects that need to be prioritized?
So those are national averages across states. And as you might imagine, there's a huge variation across states. And it's not always the states that you might expect, right? An example Adie and I love to hold up here is Utah, which really has just coalesced all of these governments into a process that we hear rave reviews about from every level of government. And if you've studied these kind of planning processes, you rarely get the 5-star ratings at every level of government, right? You might hear it from someone, but not others. Utah, they are planning kind of as a collective.
That's really interesting. So I kind of want to tie that back to my previous allusion of a question, which was about formula funding and flexible funding. And are they synonymous?
Generally, we're going to think about formula programs as more flexible than project-specific dollars. It's apropos to your parents depositing some money in your checking account, but with magically no strings attached, or just very, very limited ones, right? I think through this IJ experiment, I think we're being reminded now that, you know what? Formula funds have huge advantages. And maybe the other one to bring up that folks are really familiar with is the community development block grants, which have been steadily losing their purchasing power. But you ask any local government official, do they love their CDBG grants? They love them because they can go anything.
Well, sort of Makes me think about the types of projects that are being supported from federal dollars, whether that's formula or discretionary or these block grants. When I was working in government, we would be looking at our sources and uses. So, like, what are project components? What are the types of dollars we have to support that project? And I remember seeing, okay, we have gas tax dollars, but I can't use that to pay for pedestrian improvements, median upgrade. It was really just to do nuts and bolts of road repavement. So, how do we think about cities who are trying to diversify what their urban form looks like and invest in pedestrian cycling infrastructure, but they're tied to this antiquated idea of what transportation infrastructure is? Can you talk about how these buckets are evolving to meet the growing needs beyond the vehicle?
So they are evolving slowly. And my personal sense is that the conversation is, as usual, it's in front of where the legal standing is. Like, what buckets can we spend money on? Like, that's behind where the conversation is. What I mean by that is, find me a developer right now, and I'm bundling infrastructure people in that too, who doesn't understand better than we did in the past. Like, look, like endlessly greenfield development, even putting inside the environmental side of it, it's really expensive per capita. And part of what Ben was pointing out with those great stats that we found is that we really were robbing Peter to pay Paul, meaning that older neighborhood residents, so whether that's central city, but even inner ring suburbs, they were constantly paying to continue this greenfield experiment. There's this wake-up call that with limited fiscal resources, how do we do things a little bit better? Whether it's formula funds or even the discretionary, we need to update what the flexibilities are of the very specific project uses we can have. So we can actually start building out the community assets that we need that won't just drive more prosperity for everyone. They have authentic return on investment that help to pay for themselves much better than the model we had in the past.
I should have asked this beforehand, but I'm curious, what is the share of federal dollars that are coming through versus local taxes that are helping to pay for infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Kate. The short answer is state and local revenues make up the vast majority of infrastructure spending, and that goes for transportation too. Now, that's not to say that federal investment is negligible. They're putting in huge amounts of money into these places. This is not a kind of like Brookings style statistic for you, but something we kept hearing in all the research that we did in California over the last year was people kind of giving us roughly a third split for any project, right? They would tell us, you can roughly expect, if we're going to repave this road in our urban core, a third of that money comes from local sources, a third from state sources, and the last third is federal. So that could vary across states, right? There are sales tax measures that have become very common funding instruments in California that I think would probably make that local share a little bit higher. But it is true nationally that the biggest investors in their own infrastructure are the states and cities that own it.
That sort of leads me to my next question. In light of that, we know that the federal surface transportation bill is up for reauthorization this year. So thinking about those federal dollars, what is a meaningful reform that you would advocate for, given that it is a third or a minority share of the infrastructure funding for communities?
Yeah. Well, something that we would suggest based on our research is this idea of a regional block grant. This would be, take a chunk out of the federal formula programs that go to transportation, and instead of sending them to the states, you send them to regions. And we are Brookings Metro. We always put our priors on the table. We are pro region and metro, but we see this money going to the region as able to flow down even further from that. We think this program would settle a lot of the issues we've already talked about, right? So these issues of the administrative burden, both on the federal government, like Adie said, even more so on the cities and counties, and maybe the single planning staff member of a town that's trying to apply for a grant. If they were getting a dedicated funding stream from the federal government, it would eliminate all of the overhead required to honestly kind of gamble on a discretionary grant, put in all the thousands of dollars it takes to prep an application with no assurance you'll get the money. It also addresses this issue that we've talked about of local governments basically giving more than they get. A regional block grant could address that disparity by putting money in the hands of the people who own those assets, those roads. We think that this program could go beyond transportation and cover all kinds of infrastructure sectors. We can get into the specifics of how we imagine this, but we think there's a real opportunity in this next reauthorization for lawmakers to solve a few problems at once with a program like this.
And I wanted to add two key elements to this. When cities and counties aren't receiving their fair share, what it forces them to do, because they need the roads to be working, right? Around the time of our recording, we're doing this in the winter. So much of the country's been slammed here. What happens when you have ice on sidewalks and roads? People get furious, right? So no one likes driving over potholes, So by bringing more money back to them, it actually doesn't even necessarily mean in some places the transportation budget might go up that much. It actually might free up more money for public safety, for schools, income assistance programs. There's all kinds of things that the budget can work with. And this gets to that question that's like, well, some of this money is siloed, and it's absolutely true. But every place needs repavings. Every place is thinking often about different kinds of roadway redesigns and things. There's plenty of money they can always spend this on. So even if the federal money comes with some strings on it and some kind of a little bit of stovepiping to it, city and county budget hawks, like they are, or budgeteers, like they know how to kind of move the shekels around, if you will, to make sure that they can invest in what they want to. So this proposal, I think it's really long overdue to send more money directly back to the asset owners that are producing.
What is your sense of actually getting a reauthorization this year that will have meaningful reform in it? And what is the chance that it is just a pass through of what we've already had? Like, something needs to pass this year. When in the spectrum of what could pass, what are your thoughts on where we're at?
So something does not need to pass this year. So the law, you are totally correct. The law technically expires this coming November 2026. The reason that we don't need to pass a bill this year, though, is that the authors of the IIJA in the Senate did something very clever, which is they swirled away extra money that would cover multiple more years of spending. What's technically called advanced appropriations. So this is actually also for real nerds out there. This is why there's a difference between having roughly $800+ billion in spending, which is what Ben and I and our colleagues at Brookings Metro calculate out, and over $1 trillion, because there is money squirreled away. The ability of Congress, if they don't pass this bill, because every state and locality needs to be authorized to keep doing the spending, they'll do what the DCers call kick the can. So they'll extend the law and say, let's buy an extra year or whatever it might be.
It's been a huge topic of conversation at the national level on lots of different policies. So it's nice to just hone in on the infrastructure side. And now I want to shift from the federal work that you've done to the state work. You just produced a 5-part series on California. This report came out at the end of last year, talking through what are some of the big hurdles at the state level to delivering on the state's climate goals. And you're looking at climate through the lens of transportation, but this sort of led you to talk about the relationship between land use and housing and transportation. What is the disconnect here in California between goals and supposed dollars and implementation?
Well, we can literally see the disconnect in California because as part of this series, we mapped out the relationship between all these different laws and executive orders that have come up basically since 2005, when California passed what at the time was a landmark legislation, this Global Warming Act, right? That the state was committing to reducing carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. The transportation sector today now emits more than any other sector. And so lawmakers have seen that, passed a bunch of laws to try to hit that. So we visualized all of them. And one of the most telling things from that visualization, and then from all the other research we did, was that this transportation system really doesn't interact meaningfully with housing and land use more generally in California. And that really matters because greenhouse gas emissions are not declining from transportation enough to meet the state's goals. Even as EV registration in the state shot up, but we just don't see the decline that we need to see in emissions. And that's in large part because people are driving more, cars of all kinds, not just EVs. So what we need, this is something that Adie and I have kind of known, but really crystallized during this research. There needs to be development patterns that can support not just getting people out of cars, which you hear a lot about, but even just shorter trips, right? To answer your question directly, Kate, there is a lot of money tied up in transportation investment, but the processes that decide where that money goes don't touch housing and land use almost at all in California. And so the efforts that have been put in place to add climate to those, we basically find have been either inadequate or in a lot of cases, there were almost escape hatches built in, right? To say, if an evaluation showed a project would increase emissions, well, there's a step that we give ourselves to greenlight the project anyway. I think we are seeing a real appetite in the state to do a lot of this work and to make a lot of the changes that would more meaningfully link these investments to land use.
We can't really talk about transportation infrastructure without talking about high-speed rail. I think that's one of the greatest failures of land use and transportation planning is that the first segment of high-speed rail will be built not in urban, dense metropolitan areas where there are lots of users who are trying to make these longer trips. And I was wondering if you could use that as a case study because there's been a lot of analysis, a lot of eyes on this, sort of pointing and saying this is where it's failed. And I'm wondering if through your 5-part series and through all this research, you are seeing something different.
California made so many mistakes on high-speed rail. I mean, it is almost an astonishing level of governance here. And that's really sad. What's failed here is pretty well known. They started construction in a really questionable place. They didn't secure enough resources. The state didn't take it seriously fast enough. So the costs ballooned because construction costs ballooned all over the country. And a lot of this was due to not just in the Bay, but frankly, how they were going to deal with going from the valley into central LA. And they just took way too long on it. But the other part here, too, that I think we can only see in hindsight is that the state, and I don't want to get too into the mechanics because it is, again, it's pretty boring, but the state has secured resources for high-speed rail through its auctioning related to greenhouse gases and emissions. So in that way, there is a fascinating marketplace happening there in California, and they are investing not just in local transit agencies, but also high-speed rail. But because it hasn't delivered, what you've also seen at the same time is a failure to invest in exactly what Ben just talked about, which is what's the kind of local infrastructure we need? And the land use reforms, it's actually going to shorten trips. So for all those potential aviation savings, whether it's greenhouse gases or just people's budgets, because they could have been taking California high-speed rail, the state's not received anything, right? I mean, it both doesn't have high-speed rail and it doesn't have these changes to local land use that would have more than, in our own calculations and others too, would have more than made up for the differences in those aviation emissions they were trying to get rid of. So it's a real mess.
We know the interconnection between transportation and land use is super clear. TOD has not just sustainability outcomes and positive ones at that, but also quality of life outcomes for those who live in cities, urban families. California passed SB 79 that is going to reduce regulations around what can be developed near transit-oriented areas. And I would like you to sort of riff on that. In your 5-part series, you talk about an infill fund and paying for infrastructure that will help support infill. And I just see the cross between this infill fund and transit-oriented development, given that a lot of these TOD areas are in infill urban sites.
There are going to be transit stations, a light rail stop here, a bus rapid transit stop there, where SB 79 letting there be more development is going to be all that area needs. There are going to be developers that want to come in and build there. It's really expensive to do these developments. It costs money for the developer to not only build them, but to pay for their share of upgrades to nearby infrastructure, whether that's reconnecting utility lines, repaving roads. A lot of California cities will charge impact fees that fund everything from water to schools to libraries to parks. And then it's expensive for the city too, right? I mean, the city is going to have to do their share of the infrastructure upgrades so that they know that they can provide even things like firefighters nearby to close enough and with enough density to be able to make it to this place if there was an emergency. There's been a lot of good research done by our friends in California and elsewhere. Folks like the Turner Center at UC Berkeley have really looked at just how expensive it can be to build in California, particularly in these infill locations. The burden is immense. So this is something we heard a lot about. And to that initial problem of just how do we create an urban form that can support shorter trips, eventually support maybe mode shift from cars, we kept hearing just like, we need to build infill housing. So we think that there is roughly $400 million a year that is currently, it's gas tax revenue. It's guaranteed. Every year, the state will have this $400 million pot. And we think that money, it's currently in something called the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program at Caltrans. We think that money would be better suited when it comes to meeting the state's housing and climate goals, put into something we call the Infill Access Fund, which would help really defray the costs of all of that infrastructure near a new housing development. So maybe there's a new transit stop where because of SB 79, you can build more housing there now. But right now, it just doesn't quite pencil out for a developer. The Infill Access Fund would guarantee places the funds to help them get over that threshold, to make it pencil, and to actually be able to afford to build this new housing.
I love that. Can we talk about this trade corridor fund that you want to repurpose for infill infrastructure uses? Can you tell me a little bit about the benefit cost trade-off of shifting those dollars over?
Yeah, the blunt way to put this is that TSEP program is really just one of many that Caltrans already has that it can be used primarily on what considered, let's call them the freight routes of the state. Now, here's my beef with it, is that there is not a lack of highway lanes for trucks to travel on, to move in and out of the state or even between the major metro areas and smaller ones, within the state. That's what that TSEP program was created for. The problems that happen on those highways, when there are problems related to travel, is all the congestion from all these long distance commuters that are stuck using those highways too. We are not lacking actual infrastructure, if you will. It's a demand side problem, right? Not a supply side problem.
Interesting.
That TSEP is just a supply side intervention. It's just chasing something that doesn't make sense. What we're saying is if you can invest more in infill, not only will you attract more housing development and potentially other supportive real estate, now all of a sudden you're shorting those trips. You also might be causing less people to have to get on the highway in the first place. So you can actually accomplish TSEP's goals while doing something we think that is just as, if not maybe more important, you're asking about this kind of trade-off, of also hitting the state's climate goals. So it's really, to us, a win-win. And it gets back to this question you were actually asking earlier, where it's like, well, are we siloed and stovepiped in how we can spend money? That's ridiculous, right? So if the gas tax money's coming in, spend it on the supportive infrastructure that improves transportation outcomes. We can't be so rigid in our thinking.
There are so many things I want to unpack, but I want to hone in on this idea of an infill developer, really any city developer is paying some sort of development fee that's supposed to be going towards the infrastructure to support the development. And in some cases, reports are saying that it's $100,000 per door, or in the tens of thousands of dollars, which is prohibitive for developers. And what I was reading in your report is you're not really saying that this $400 million a year should go to defray development fees or substitute for them. I just want to understand what your thoughts are as experts in this space between development fees and allocation at the state level towards infill infrastructure.
The way I would answer, and we are not impact fee experts in California for sure, the budget leads in these municipalities, and you know them, right, Kate? Like, they're really smart. They're really amazing civil servants. You give them more tools to work with, they'll figure out how to do good by them. And in this case, what we're saying is if you give them flexible infrastructure related funds, they can think better about how they can actually help deliver projects. Does that mean they might be able to lower their impact fees? Maybe. Maybe it just means that actually, as you know, but you know personally, right? Like, it's not just the impact fees. They also need to pay oftentimes for infrastructure upgrades. So if this means now the infrastructure upgrade cost gets reduced significantly, okay, all of a sudden those impact fees don't sound so bad. And know this, right? Developers have to make a profit. They should. So this is all going to be passed along to the consumer in the end of the day anyways.
This connection between land use and transportation is starting to become more prevalent in policies, but there's still structural differences between transportation funding and housing funding. So at the federal level, we have HUD, Department for Housing and Urban Development, and then we also have the Department of Transportation. We have the same parallel system here in California where we have HCD and we have Caltrans. And I'm curious, like, what do you see as a model that works, or how do we sort of break down these structural silos so that land use and transportation resources can better support each other?
I've been working in this space 2 decades, and I think it's really easy to come out of policy school, planning school, whatever it might be, to first start working, be like, you know what, like there's some perfect agency governance design out there. We just got to find it. I've been looking for that pot of gold, and I'm not sure it's out there. Ben, and I'm really giving him a ton of credit on this. And I really do urge people, if you're listening to this and you work in California policy, whether at the local to state level, look at these process maps that Ben put together, because it's not just that it shows you the workflow, but Ben also did an amazing job pointing out like exactly where the problem areas are. So I'm not here saying like there couldn't be some reorganization, but there's no perfect way to do this. What I think probably matters more, of course, there's that classic thing. You need good leaders, right? Like good executive leadership and developers in city government, like that's indispensable. Like they can get things over the finish line, period, right? But putting that part aside, the other part I think that's really important is this flexibility and how the funds work. California is not short of plans and climate-focused plans at the local level, but oftentimes they just don't deliver on it. And there is weird machinations that happen that allow funds to flow to oftentimes questionable projects and investments relative to what are the on-the-books goals of these regions. And right now, it's just way too expensive to develop an infill and still too cheap and easy to invest in greenfield locations. Rather than, do you melt like Caltrans into HCD, or do you have some new like czar? Like it could work. It could work. But a lot of what you'll see Ben and I recommend is, hey, melt away regulations that really aren't delivering much. Like you just don't need them. And the state's already been doing this on CEQA reform. But there's this other part too of like put money in the right places and, let places go to work and like find things that they can do. What we've been doing, I'm comfortable saying, in California's ground zero for this for a century now is, we're letting places get creative and make investments on the urban periphery. I mean, that was our investment model. And with the public sector really underwriting much of it in so many ways, we've got to flip that equation now because it's just not delivering enough in the ways that we need, especially in California where they have these real climate and social prosperity goals on the books.
Thanks for tuning in to Building Better Cities. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you could help spread the word by sharing with someone, it would mean so much to us. To learn more about our work, check out buildingbettercities.com. We're excited to keep the conversation going, so until next time, let's keep building better cities together.